Well, hello everyone. We're back to talk about Rule 3 of the USGA and R&A rules of golf. So, let's talk about the competition. As most people look at golf, they will think of all the major games that have been played, or the tournaments, most recently the Open, of course, in which Rory won. And primarily, Rule 3 looks at three major components. One of the questions you need to ask yourself is, in this game, am I playing match play or am I playing stroke play? You also have to figure out whether you're playing as an individual or are you playing with a partner who is on your side. And then in terms of the scoring, whether you are assessing either by gross scores, where no handicap strokes are applied, or net scores, where handicap strokes are applied. I can do one episode, or it'll probably take more, purely on handicaps. But anyway, let's just focus on the key elements of, let's say, every competition. Under Rule 3.1a, the form that you're going to play is most likely either going to be a match play or a stroke play. And they're very different forms of play. In match play, under Rule 3.2, a player and an opponent compete against each other based on the holes won, lost, or tied. In the regular form of stroke play, which is under Rule 3.3, all the players compete with one another based on the total score. And it is then by adding those scores that you get the number of strokes. So you include the strokes made and the penalty strokes, and then on each hole in all the rounds. And most of the rules apply to both of these form of plays, but there are certain rules that only apply to one or the other. And very often it's also important to look at the committee procedures under Section 6C -1 is because the competition, there may be scenarios where competition combines the two forms of play in a single round. So obviously it would make total sense to understand what kind of rule competition that you are playing under so that you know how to score. Now, there are other forms of stroke play. So Rule 21 covers other forms, and it includes Stableford, maximum score, and par bogey that use a different scoring method. And so these rules 1 to 20, apply in these forms of play, and it's also modified under Rule 21. We will touch upon those later. Now, how players compete. So first, let's ask the question, will you be playing as an individual or as a partner? And this is under Rule 3.1b. So when you're competing, if you do play with a partner, obviously you'll be competing together as a side. Now, even though the rules say 1 to 20 and 25 focus on the individual play, they also focus on competitions involving the partners, also under the category of what they call foursomes and four ball, right, under Rule 22 and 23. So the next question, now that you know how many people you're playing with, albeit just you're playing as an individual, is the scoring. So there are gross scores or there are net scores. Now, under 3.1c, scratch competitions are considered gross score for a hole or a round where their total number of scores, including the strokes made and penalty strokes. The player's handicap, is not applied. And then you have the handicap competitions in which the player's net score for a hole or round is the gross score adjusted for the player's handicap strokes. And this is done so that players of differing abilities can compete in a fair way. And I should also mention that these changes to the handicap were done, I think, a couple of years so that whereas in the past there may have been different levels and different ways of assessing one's ability, the handicap system now is supposed to be done in such a way, from what I understand, so that it is fair for everyone. So it doesn't matter if you're a single digit or whether you're just a beginner, at least in terms of the whole scheme of things, the outcome should be as fair as possible. So now let's have a look at match play. So what's the purpose of match play? Under Rule 3.2, a match play has very specific rules, particularly in terms of concessions and giving information about the number of strokes, because the player and opponent, in essence, compete solely against each other on every hole. They can see each other's play and they can protect their own interests. So how do you win a hole, you say? Well, they win when a player competes a hole in a few strokes, including strokes made and penalty strokes than the other opponent. So in other words, the less stroke, the better. And the opponent concedes a hole, or the opponent gets the penalty, the loss of a hole. Now, if the opponent's ball in motion needs to be holed to or tie to the hole, and the ball is deliberately deflected or stopped by any person at a time when there is no reasonable chance for it to be holed, such as when the ball has rolled past the hole and will not roll back, the result of the hole has been decided and the player wins the hole. This is under Rule 11.2a. You could have a tying of a hole. So a hole is tied, also known as halved, when the player and opponent complete the hole in the same number of strokes. So this includes strokes made and penalty strokes, or the player and opponent agree to treat the hole as tied. Now, we should note that this is allowed only after at least one of the players has made a stroke to begin the hole. In other words, I guess what the rules basically envisage is you don't see people giving up. You see people at least giving it a try. And in terms of winning a hole, a player wins a match when the player leads the opponent by more holes than remain to be played, the opponent concedes the match, or the opponent is disqualified. So when we look at the chances, well, the chances of an opponent being disqualified is probably very far and few between. The opponent conceding also far and few between, I'd say, unless it's very obvious. So it's more likely that looking at the numbers. Now, in what circumstances would you see a tied match, albeit it being extended after the final hole? So you would see a match is extended one hole at a time until there is a winner. This is under Rule 5.1, and an extended match is a continuation of the same round, not a new round, because clearly we want to see a winner and the winner is playing the same game, so hence. The hole is played in the same order as the round unless the committee sets a different order. But terms of the competition may say that the match will end in a tie rather than extended. Have any of you ever watched a game where there is a tie? I personally have yet to see, at least recently, so that could be interesting to find out in what circumstances you've seen a tie as opposed to a clear winner. And when result is final, the result of a match becomes final in the way stated by the committee. And also I should actually mention, so I actually observed in the Abu Dhabi European versus the English and the Irish teams. And what was really interesting for me was all the players did so well until at the very, very end, literally, I think it was the European team won by a last putt. So literally a last score in which they won. And it was so, I can just imagine how frustrating and infuriating at the end it might be. I mean, sport is sport, right? You either win or lose. But in that particular instance, you could really imagine after having played so many hours to then lose the game. But there we go. And we also need to look at when the result is recorded on an official scoreboard or other identified place. I mean, to be fair, so I have also volunteered in another game, also in the UAE, where the scores are very much spontaneous. So you see the results and you input the score. And normally what happens is the players that themselves will keep record, as we mentioned in Rule 1, and also the caddy most likely. When the result is reported to the person identified by the committee. Now let's talk about concessions. So Rule 3.2b governs concessions, and this is where a player may concede a stroke, a hole, or a match. And they do so, and there is an allowed time before the next opponent's stroke is made. So you've got to observe that the opponent has completed the hole with a score that includes that conceded stroke, and the ball may be removed by anyone. A concession made while the opponent's hole is still in motion after the previous stroke applies to the opponent's next stroke unless the ball is holed, in which case the concession does not matter. The player may concede the opponent's next stroke by deflecting or stopping the opponent's ball in motion only if that is done specifically to concede the next stroke, and only when there is no reasonable chance the ball can be held. Now, this is a complicated one, and so I guess if one decides that they're going to concede a hole, they may as well do it sooner than later. Otherwise, it may cause confusion. Conceding a hole, it's allowed at any time before the ball is completed, and this is under Rule 6.5, and including before the player starts the hole. A player and opponents are not allowed to agree to concede holes to each other for the purpose of shortening the match. If they do so, this is not allowed. This is disqualification. So the reason why anyone would want to concede a hole is important, and certainly here, shortening the game is not one of them. Conceding the match, this is allowed at any time before the result of the match is decided, including before the players start the match. Now, you might ask, well, how do these concessions are made? They're only made when they're A, communicated clearly, so it can be done orally or by action that clearly shows the player's intent to concede the stroke, the hole, or the match, i.e. by giving a gesture, or B, if the opponent lifts their ball in breach of the rule because of a reasonable misunderstanding that the player's statement or action was a concession of the next stroke, a hole or a match, there is no penalty that the ball must be replaced on its original spot. The concession is final and it cannot be declined or withdrawn. In other words, if you've made up your mind that you're going to concede a hole, it's tough luck. You can't really go back on it. Under Rule 3.2c, applying the handicaps in a handicap match. Now, I need to give a caveat on handicaps. I am still learning the rules of the game, and for me, I definitely think this is something I need to seek counsel and discussion. So as I go through this, please by all means, have your questions. You can share with me. I can, of course, engage with you in the conversations, but it is not straightforward. First things first, let's talk about declaring handicaps. The player and the opponent should tell each other the handicaps before the match, and if a player declares a wrong handicap either before or during the match and does not correct the mistake before the opponent makes their next stroke, there are actual consequences. If, for instance, a particular individual declares the handicap too high, that particular player is disqualified if this affects the number of strokes the player gives or takes. If it does not, then there is no penalty. Now, if the handicap is declared too low, there is no penalty and the player must use the declared lower handicap to calculate the number of strokes the player gives or gets. Now let's look at the rules on how holes when handicap strokes are applied. Handicap strokes are given by hole and the lower net score wins the hole. So generally we understand, lower scores are usually a good thing. And if a tied match is extended, a handicap strokes are often given by hole in the same way as in the round, unless the committee sets a different way of doing so. So as you might imagine, if you're playing a game of 18 holes, it is probably inconceivable that the rules of the game will suddenly change, right? Unless there's very good reason to do so. So for the most part, you can probably safely say you'll play a game according to the rules that have been set up from the very beginning, unless the committee tells you otherwise. Each player is responsible for knowing the holes where they were given or get the handicap strokes based on the stroke index allocation that's set up by the committee, and that is often found on the scorecard. Usually before you play a game, you would sign up and have your scorecard, so hopefully that will make it clear to you as to what is required of you. If the players fail to apply or mistakenly apply handicap strokes on a hole, the agreed result of the hole stands unless the players correct the mistake in time. Rule 3.2D3. Now let me ask you a question. What is the time that you have? Now normally we get 3 minutes to find a ball. If within those 3 minutes you can't find it, you have a few options, but most often you can declare it, well, as being lost in essence, and play a second ball. Now, what are the responsibilities of the player and the opponent? So, telling the opponent about the number of strokes taken. So, at any time during a player of a hole or after the hole is completed, the opponent may ask the player for the number of strokes. So, this is actually permissible. And so it will give the opponent the opportunity to decide how to play the next stroke and the rest of the hole, or to confirm the result of the hole just completed. When, for instance, you're going to ask for the number of strokes that are taken, or when you're going to give that information, potentially, without even being asked, it's important to give the right number of strokes for obvious reasons in terms of accuracy of the game. Now, in a scenario where a player fails to respond to the opponent's request and or it's basically treated as giving the wrong number of strokes taken. And for doing so, the player will get a penalty, a general penalty, which is equivalent to the loss of a hole if they give the opponent the wrong number of strokes taken, unless the player corrects this mistake in time. So what does it mean to correct something in time? So the wrong number of strokes given while playing the hole, the player must give the right number of strokes taken before the opponent goes to make another hole or takes a similar action, such as conceding the player's next stroke or the hole. And B, a wrong number of strokes given after the hole is completed, they must give the right number of strokes again before either the player makes a stroke to begin another hole or takes a similar action. And for the final hole of the match, before the result of the match is final. Now, you might look at this and you go, okay, so in essence, you need to respond quite quickly. As you know, for those who watch games or play themselves, timing is of essence, and this actually applies to many things, be it that you are subject to a penalty, be it that, looking for a ball or so forth, really, I think the way to think about it is very, very hard to go back and in a scenario like this, if, for instance, for whatever reason, one particular player gives a wrong number of strokes to the other player, the criteria or the expectation is you're going to correct it pretty much right away, because otherwise the game plays on and you're going to suffer that loss of a hole. And there won't be any discussions about it, probably. It's just going to be decided. Now, there are exceptions where there is no penalty if there is no effect on the result of the hole. Now, this is a very fancy way of It's a bit like, I'm thinking of, oh, is it The Merchant of Venice? It's the equivalent of a pound of flesh without a drop of blood. Let's see if you can do that. In other words, you may be blessed with the idea of not getting any penalty on the basis that there is no effect on the consequence of the whole. Now, unless you're able to look into a crystal ball, I think that's going to be very difficult for the exception to apply. So if you, for example, as a player, you give the wrong number of strokes after a hole is completed, but this does not affect the opponent's understanding, of whether the hole was won, lost, or tied, then there is no penalty. Now, you may also look at Rule 3.2, which looks at telling the opponent about the penalty. Now, when a player gets a penalty, the player must tell the opponent about that penalty as soon as reasonable. And taking into account how near the player is to the opponent and all these other factors, there is really no excuse. In a scenario where it is not possible to tell the opponent about the penalty before the opponent makes that next stroke, then this requirement applies even if the player does not know about the penalty. Oh, this is interesting. Wait a second. This requirement applies even if the player does not know about the penalty, because players are expected to recognize when they have breached a rule. Okay, well, I don't know how this would look like if a player doesn't know that they have suffered a penalty and they don't correct their mistake before the opponent makes another stroke. Now, the chances are the player will get a general penalty, but it's also, this is where I talk about, you can probably play a better game at golf if you know the golf rules. Because imagine how embarrassing at a court that you've got a penalty stroke and you don't even know this, right? I mean, there's nothing wrong. I'm also learning the game that, we all learn whilst we play. But I guess it's just one of those things. If you know what you're in for and you know what, penalties you've suffered, then at least you could plan a little bit better for the next hole, how you'd play the game. The exception to the rule, well, no penalty applies when the opponent knew of the player's penalty. Now, let's have a look at this. If the opponent knew that the player had a penalty, such as when seeing the player obviously take penalty relief, the player gets no penalty for failing to tell the opponent. Ah, I get it. Okay, so did you guys get that? So, interestingly, whilst the obligation is on the player to note their own penalty, the obligation is not necessarily the same for the opponent who observes the player playing the penalty. Now, we need to be careful here because there are some rules, for example, where you, as a party, agree to the other side to shorten the game. Penalty applies for both parties. When this situation is very clear, it doesn't apply to the opponent. Now, knowing the match score. The players are expected to know the match score. That is, whether one of them leads by a certain number of holes or the match is tied. If the player mistakenly agree on a wrong match score, they may correct the match score. Either player makes a stroke to begin another hole or the final hole before the result of the match is final. You're going to ask, what does that mean? B, if not corrected in time, that wrong match score becomes the actual match score. Do you see any contradiction? Do you see anything that doesn't seem to fit? Well, okay, if you look at A, what I mentioned before, under Rule 3.2A5, you can correct a score before the result of the match is final. And it sits, I suppose it can sit quite neatly, that if not correct in time, the match score becomes the actual match score. So if the long and short of it would be, if there are any errors, you've got to correct it quickly, timely fashion, because even though in writing here it says before the result of the match is final, if you don't move fast enough, in essence, it's going to be too late. Are there exceptions? Of course there are. So when the player requests ruling in time. Now, if a player makes a timely request for a ruling, this is under Rule 20.1b, and is found that the opponent either 1. Gave the wrong number of strokes taken, or 2. Failed to tell the player about a penalty, the wrong match score must be corrected. Now, protecting your own rights and interests. So obviously players in a match have their own rights and interests to protect under the rules. I mean, the goal of playing the games are to win. So if the player knows or believes that the opponent has breached a rule that has a penalty, the player may choose to either or not to act on the breach. But if the player and opponent agree not to apply the rules or a penalty they know about, and either of those players has started the round, they are both disqualified. And this is under Rule 1.3b. We're going to have a look at this because this is fascinating. If the player and the opponent disagree whether one or more of them breach the rule, either player may protect their rights by asking for a ruling under Rule 20.1b. Okay, we're really going to take a step back here. So imagine you're playing a game. Now you see an opponent and they appear to have a penalty breach. Now you don't say anything. Okay, this is my understanding. You don't say anything. The other player doesn't recognize that they've had a penalty stroke. They are most likely to suffer that penalty stroke, but it doesn't impact you. You're just playing the game. But in a scenario where you do know that there is a breach and you walk up to the other player, there are two possibilities. Either the player agrees with you. If they disagree with you, then it needs to be raised. And in a scenario, if both parties, i.e. there was a penalty stroke, but you decide, well, let's just forget it, then both sides get disqualified. So it's quite clear that in no way do we undermine the impact of penalties and recognizing that there are penalties. Because imagine if it was found in terms of intent, and of course you go with people playing the game and with goodwill. It's only when it's really uncertain whether it was a penalty or not that you get the referee. Well, you get the referee in to sort out. Well, to see, who is responsible for acting out on any breaches that they see or are told. Again, this is in Rule 20b1. But quite clearly, if one ignores the penalties that they've breached, ultimately the consequences are quite, disqualification. There's no need to play anymore. Let's look at Rule 3.3. This is about stroke play. Stroke play for me, I think, is far more straightforward because you're literally just counting the strokes. And this is where each player competes against the other in the competition, and all players need to be treated equal under the rules. So you might ask, well, who is a winner in stroke play? So a player who completes all the rounds in the fewest total of scores, this is including the strokes made and the penalty strokes, is the winner. In the handicap competition, this means the fewest total net scores. Now, when it comes to scoring in stroke play, I mentioned a moment ago that you would have a scorecard, that you would have marker. Usually, the player is the marker, albeit that they're identified by the committee and chosen by a player in a way that's approved by the committee. The player must have the same marker for the entire round, unless the committee approves a change either before or after it happens. The marker's responsibility is to enter and certify the whole scores on the scorecard. And after each hole during the competition, during the round, the marker should confirm with the player the number of strokes on that hole, including the strokes made and penalty strokes, and enter that gross score on the scorecard. When the round has ended, the marker must certify the whole scores on the scorecard, and if the player has had more than one marker, each marker must certify the scores for those holes where the mark was made. But if one of the markers saw the player play all the holes, that marker must certify the scores for all those holes. Now, a marker may refuse to certify a player's hole that the marker believes is wrong. And in such a situation, the committee will need to consider the available evidence and make a decision on the player's score of the hole. If the marker still refuses to certify the player's score, the committee may certify the whole score or accept certification from someone else who saw the player's actions on the hole in question. If a marker who is a player knowingly certifies a wrong score for a hole, the marker should be disqualified. And this is under Rule 1.2a. And if you look at it, in essence, having a clear way of scoring and scoring accurately is probably in the player's best interest. Now, let's talk about players' responsibility again in certifying the holes and returning the scorecard. So during the round, the player will need to keep track of the scores for each round. And when the round has ended, the player actually should note carefully and check the whole scores that they've entered by the marker, raise any concerns with the committee. They must ensure that the marker certifies the whole score on the scorecard, and they must not change the whole score entered by the marker except with the marker's agreement or with the committee. But neither the player nor the marker is required to make any extra certification of the changed score. And they must certify the holes and promptly return it to the committee. Very often you'll find in competitions that's what happens. The players play and then they, in essence, return it for scoring. Rule 3 is actually quite a long rule. So I'm going to split this up and we're going to do the second part of Rule 3 and looking at scorings and clarifications in match play. So if you like what you hear, please like and share with your friends, with your colleagues, and I look forward to speaking with you next time.